The hatred between Jews and Samaritans was old, older than the grandparents of anyone living, older than the crumbling stones of forgotten shrines, older than the memories that people thought they were preserving but were actually inventing with each retelling. It stretched back more than 7 centuries to the dark days when Assyrian armies had swept down from the north and shattered the kingdom of Israel like a clay pot thrown against a wall. The conquerors had carried away the 10 northern tribes and resettled the land with foreigners, peoples from Babylon and Cutha, from Avva and Hamath and Sepharvaim, who brought their own gods and their own customs, and eventually intermarried with the Israelites who remained. The result was a people who were neither fully Israelite nor fully pagan, a hybrid population that worshipped the God of Abraham alongside the deities of their ancestors, a community that the Jews of the south regarded with a contempt that bordered on revulsion. The Samaritans told a different story, of course. They claimed to be the true descendants of the patriarchs, the faithful remnant who had preserved the authentic traditions while the Jews of Jerusalem corrupted the faith with additions and innovations. They accepted only the 5 books of Moses as scripture, rejecting the prophets and writings that the Jews held sacred. They insisted that Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem, was the place God had chosen for his dwelling, the mountain where Abraham had nearly sacrificed Isaac, where Moses had commanded that blessings be pronounced over the people, where the true altar had stood before David's illegitimate transfer of worship to the southern capital. The temple they had built on Gerizim's summit had been a declaration of independence, a monument to their conviction that they, not the Jews, had remained faithful to the original covenant. That temple was gone now, destroyed more than a century earlier by the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus, in a campaign of religious warfare that had deepened the rift beyond any possibility of repair. The Samaritans had not forgotten. They would never forget. And the Jews who travelled between Judea and Galilee demonstrated their own long memory by taking the longer route around Samaria rather than passing through its defiled territory. Better to add days to a journey than to risk contamination from a people who were worse than Gentiles, because Gentiles, at least, had never known the truth and abandoned it. This was the world into which a woman was born in the village of Sychar, a small settlement nestled in the shadow of Mount Gerizim in the heart of Samaritan territory. The village had its own history, its own wounds, its own quiet rhythms of planting and harvest, birth and death. It lay near the ancient plot of ground that Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor centuries earlier, and it drew its water from a well that tradition attributed to the patriarch himself, a deep shaft sunk into the rock, fed by underground springs, providing water that was cool and sweet even in the hottest months of summer. The well was a gathering place, a social centre, the location where women came each morning and evening to fill their jars and exchange the gossip that bound the community together. The woman whose story would one day be told wherever the gospel reached did not come to the well in the morning or the evening. She came at noon, when the sun hammered down on the dusty path, and the heat rose in shimmering waves from the baked earth. She came alone, her water jar balanced on her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the ground before her feet. She came at the hour when no one else would be there, because the presence of others had become unbearable. Not because she hated them, but because she knew what they thought of her, what they whispered when she passed, what their sidelong glances and sudden silences communicated more clearly than words ever could. Her name is not recorded in the scripture that would eventually preserve her encounter, and perhaps this is fitting. She represents all the unnamed ones, the forgotten ones, the women and men whose stories are known only to God and to themselves. But her circumstances can be reconstructed from the details that the narrative provides, and those circumstances paint a picture of profound isolation and accumulated pain. She had been married 5 times. In a culture where marriage was the foundation of a woman's identity and security, 5 marriages meant 5 upheavals, 5 disruptions, 5 experiences of loss that would have marked her as fundamentally unlucky at best and cursed at worst. The reasons for these marriages ending could have varied. Death might have claimed some of her husbands, divorce might have severed others, the complex web of levirate obligation and family negotiation might have passed her from one man to another in ways she had little power to control. Women in the ancient Near East did not typically initiate divorce. They were divorced, discarded, sent away with a certificate of dismissal that freed their husbands to remarry while leaving them dependent on the charity of relatives or the uncertain prospects of finding another man willing to take them in. By the time of her encounter at the well, she had stopped pretending that marriage was even possible. The man she now lived with was not her husband, a situation that placed her definitively outside the boundaries of respectable society. Whether this arrangement was her choice or her only option, whether she had given up on the institution that had failed her so many times, or simply accepted the protection of a man unwilling to make her his legal wife, the result was the same. She was marked. The village knew, the women at the well knew, and their knowledge created a zone of exclusion around her that was as effective as any physical barrier. So she came at noon, when the well would be deserted, when she could fill her jar in solitude and return home without enduring the pointed conversations that fell silent at her approach. The daily walk had become a ritual of avoidance, a strategy for minimizing the pain of rejection, a small accommodation to a reality she could not change. She had learned to live on the margins, to expect nothing from others, to ask for nothing except the water that sustained physical life. The other kind of water, the living connections of community and belonging and love, had dried up long ago, if it had ever existed at all. The path from Sychar to Jacob's well wound through terrain that had witnessed more history than most lands could claim. These were the hills where Abraham had built altars and received promises, where Jacob had wrestled with angels and buried foreign gods, where Joshua had renewed the covenant and the judges had fought their desperate battles. The very dust beneath her feet was saturated with the memory of divine encounters, with moments when heaven had touched earth, and ordinary people had found themselves caught up in purposes larger than they could comprehend. But the woman walking that path on this particular day was not thinking about history or theology or the grand narratives of her people. She was thinking about water and heat and the long afternoon that stretched before her and the life that had become a succession of empty days distinguished only by their varying degrees of loneliness. She did not know that this day would be different. She could not have known, could not have imagined that the Messiah himself was at that moment travelling toward her, that the encounter awaiting her at the well would become one of the most significant conversations in the history of Revelation, that her name would be forgotten, but her story would be remembered for as long as people gathered to speak of what God had done in Christ. She knew only what she had always known, that the well was ahead, that the jar was heavy, that the sun was merciless, and that she would make this journey again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, until her body gave out or her circumstances changed, or death finally released her from the weariness that had settled into her bones. The loneliness of her situation was not merely social, but spiritual as well. The Samaritans worshipped the God of Abraham, but their worship had become entangled with the ancient controversies that separated them from their Jewish cousins. Where was God truly to be found? On Mount Gerizim, as her people insisted? In Jerusalem, as the Jews claimed? Or perhaps nowhere at all? Perhaps the whole apparatus of temples and sacrifices and sacred geography was a human invention, a way of organizing the chaos of existence without actually touching the divine presence that everyone sought and no one seemed to find. The woman had her traditions and her assumptions, but she also had her doubts, her questions, her suspicion that something essential was missing from the religious certainties that both Samaritans and Jews proclaimed with such confidence. She had heard whispers about a Messiah who was coming, the one Moses had promised, the prophet who would arise and explain everything, who would resolve the ancient disputes and establish the true worship that both communities claimed to possess, and neither seemed to fully understand. The Samaritans called him the Tahib, the restorer, or returning one, and they expected him to appear on Mount Gerizim and vindicate their traditions against the claims of Jerusalem. But such expectations felt remote from her daily reality. Theological abstractions that had little to do with water jars and failed marriages, and the heaviness of walking alone under the midday sun. The village of Sychar receded behind her as she made her way along the familiar path. Ahead, she could see the low stone structure that marked the wellhead, the ropes and buckets that visitors used to draw water from the depths, the fig trees that provided patches of shade for travellers who stopped to rest during the hottest hours. Everything appeared as it always appeared, dusty, still, unremarkable. Just another day in a succession of unremarkable days. But as she drew closer, she realised that the well was not deserted after all. A figure sat near the wellhead, a man whose posture suggested weariness, whose clothing marked him as a stranger, whose presence in this Samaritan place at this particular hour was inexplicable by any ordinary calculation. He was alone, no servants, no companions, no retinue that might explain why a Jewish traveller would stop at a Samaritan well rather than pushing on to friendlier territory. The woman hesitated, her steps slowing as she assessed this unexpected complication. Her routine depended on solitude, on the predictable absence of others, on the assurance that she could complete her task without the discomfort of human interaction. A stranger at the well was an intrusion, a disruption, a variable that her carefully constructed avoidance strategies had not accounted for. She could turn back, wait for him to leave, return later when the well would surely be empty again. But the jar was heavy on her shoulder, and the walk back to the village would mean making the journey twice more under the brutal sun, and something, curiosity perhaps, or simply the resignation of a woman who had learned that life rarely accommodated her preferences, kept her moving forward. She would draw her water quickly, ignore the stranger as strangers should be ignored, and be on her way before any interaction became necessary. She did not know that the stranger was waiting for her specifically. She did not know that his presence at this well, at this hour, in this Samaritan territory that Jews avoided, was the result of a divine appointment written into the fabric of history before the foundation of the world. She did not know that the conversation about to begin would strip away her defenses, expose her wounds, and offer her something she had stopped believing was possible. A lonely woman approached a well, carrying the weight of her jar and her shame and her accumulated disappointments. And the Messiah sat waiting, ready to offer her water that would never run dry. The journey from Judea to Galilee could be made by several routes, and the one that passed through Samaria was both the shortest and the most avoided. Devout Jews preferred the longer path, crossing the Jordan near Jericho, travelling north through the Decapolis on the eastern side of the river, and crossing back near the Sea of Galilee. The additional miles and days were considered a small price to pay for avoiding the contaminated territory that lay between the two centres of Jewish life. To pass through Samaria was to risk ritual defilement, to encounter people whose very existence was an offence to proper religious sensibilities, to wade through a land that faithful Jews regarded as spiritually toxic. Jesus chose the route through Samaria. The Gospel of John records this decision with a peculiar phrase: he had to pass through Samaria. The Greek word is dii, and it carries connotations not merely of geographical necessity, but of divine compulsion, the same word used elsewhere in Scripture when something must happen, because God has ordained it. Jesus did not pass through Samaria because it was convenient or because he was indifferent to the cultural taboos of his people. He passed through Samaria because there was an appointment waiting for him, written into the purposes of God before time began, and that appointment required his presence at a particular well, at a particular hour, for an encounter with a particular woman whose life was about to change forever. The disciples who travelled with him did not understand this, of course. They saw only the practical implications of their rabbi's choice, the awkwardness of requesting hospitality from people who despise Jews, the social complications of travelling through hostile territory, the raised eyebrows and pointed questions they would face from fellow Galileans who learned which route they had taken. But Jesus moved with a purposefulness that discouraged objection, his face set toward the north, his pace unhurried but deliberate. He knew where he was going, he knew why he was going there, and he knew what awaited him at the end of the day's journey. The morning had begun in Judea, in the region where John the Baptist had been drawing crowds to the Jordan, and where Jesus' own ministry had been gathering momentum. Reports had reached the Pharisees that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, a comparison that was technically inaccurate since Jesus himself did not perform the baptisms, but accurate enough in its broader implication that a new movement was growing and threatening to overshadow even the Baptist's remarkable success. The religious authorities were watching, calculating, beginning to formulate the opposition that would eventually culminate in a cross outside Jerusalem. Jesus knew that his hour had not yet come, that the confrontation must wait until the appointed time, and so he withdrew from Judea to continue his work in Galilee. The road north wound through hills that still bore the marks of ancient cultivation, terraced slopes where vineyards had once flourished, olive groves that provided shade and sustenance to travellers who stopped to rest beneath their branches. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way, rocky and dry, but dotted with wildflowers in the spring, and possessing a spare grandeur that rewarded those with eyes to see it. Jesus and his disciples walked this road as countless travellers had walked it before them, their sandals raising small clouds of dust with each step, their conversation rising and falling with the natural rhythms of men on a journey. As they entered Samaritan territory, the disciples grew quieter. The villages they passed bore names that echoed through Israelite history, but the people who inhabited them now were strangers, familiar in appearance, speaking a dialect that was almost but not quite the same as their own, worshipping a god they claimed was the God of Abraham, but doing so in ways that seemed distorted and wrong. The disciples kept their eyes forward, their interactions minimal, their discomfort evident in the tension of their shoulders and the clipped quality of their responses. They wanted to pass through this land as quickly as possible, to emerge on the other side into the comfortable familiarity of Galilee, to put this necessary detour behind them and forget it had ever happened. Jesus showed no such discomfort. He walked through Samaria as he walked through every place, fully present, attentive to the people and the landscape, unhurried by the anxiety that plagued his companions. He noticed the women working in the fields, the children playing in the village squares, the old men sitting in the shade and watching the strangers pass with wary eyes. He saw them not as obstacles to be avoided or contaminations to be feared, but as what they truly were, people bearing the image of God, people carrying wounds they had never asked for, people waiting for a salvation they were not sure would ever come. The sun climbed higher as the morning wore on, and the heat intensified with each passing hour. By midday, the temperature had become oppressive, the kind of heat that drove sensible people indoors, that reduced physical activity to the bare minimum necessary for survival, that made every step feel like a negotiation with an hostile environment. The disciples were flagging, their water supplies running low, their bodies crying out for rest and shade and sustenance. They had been walking since early morning, and the accumulated fatigue was beginning to tell. It was then that Jesus led them to the well. Jacob's well lay near the village of Sychar, at the foot of Mount Gerizim, in a location that would have been meaningful to anyone familiar with the patriarchal narratives. This was the land that Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor, the plot of ground where Joseph's bones had been buried after the Exodus, the place where the covenant promises had taken root in actual soil centuries before David established Jerusalem as the capital of his kingdom. The well itself was ancient, dug, according to tradition, by Jacob himself when he settled in this region, and it remained in use after more than a millennium and a half, a testament to the quality of its water and the skill of its construction. The well was deep, perhaps 100 feet from surface to water level, and drawing from it required either a bucket and rope or the assistance of someone who had brought such equipment. Jesus had neither. He sat down beside the well, his body weary from the journey, his throat dry from the heat, his physical needs as real and pressing as those of any other traveller who had paused at this spot to rest. The gospel makes no attempt to hide his humanity. He was tired, he was thirsty, he needed what any human being would need after a morning of walking through the Samaritan hills under the summer sun. The disciples, meanwhile, had continued on to the village to buy food. This errand would have required them to interact with Samaritans, to enter their shops and conduct business with people they considered unclean, to participate in the ordinary commerce of human life across the boundaries that their tradition had erected. It was a small transgression, perhaps, easily justified by necessity. One must eat, after all, even in enemy territory, but it was a transgression nonetheless, a crack in the wall of separation that Jesus seemed determined to widen with each passing day. And so Jesus sat alone at the well, in the heat of the day, in the heart of Samaritan country, waiting. The stillness of the scene is worth pausing to appreciate. Here was the one through whom all things had been made, the Word who was with God in the beginning, the source of all life and all sustenance, sitting beside a hole in the ground because he was thirsty. Here was the one who would soon offer living water that would spring up to eternal life. experiencing the physical sensation of desperate need for ordinary water. Here was the Lord of Glory, the King of Kings, the Alpha and Omega, resting his tired body on the stones of a well that a patriarch had dug 17 centuries earlier, waiting for a woman whose name he knew, though she had never heard his. The theology of the Incarnation finds one of its most poignant expressions in this moment. God had become human, truly human, subject to the limitations and vulnerabilities that humanity entails. Jesus was not pretending to be tired. He was tired. He was not performing thirst for pedagogical effect. He was genuinely thirsty. The creator of the universe had entered his creation so completely that he now depended on that creation for the basic necessities of continued existence. He needed water. He needed food. He needed rest. And in needing these things, he demonstrated that the salvation he came to bring was not an escape from human experience, but a transformation of it from within. The dust settled around him as he waited. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. In the distance, the sounds of the village carried faintly on the still air. Voices, the bleating of goats, the rhythms of daily life continuing as they always continued, oblivious to the significance of the stranger resting at their well. The disciples had disappeared into Sychar on their errand, and Jesus was alone with the silence and the sun and the knowledge of what was about to happen. He could see her approaching from a long way off, a solitary figure on the path from the village, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had made this journey countless times before. She carried a water jar, the large ceramic vessel that women used to transport water from well to home, and her posture suggested the weariness of routine rather than the purposefulness of urgent errand. She did not know that anyone would be at the well. She had chosen this hour precisely because the well would normally be deserted. The sight of a stranger sitting there must have given her pause, must have disrupted the careful calculations by which she navigated her isolated existence. But she kept coming. Whatever hesitation she felt, whatever impulse toward retreat might have flickered through her mind, she overrode it and continued toward the well. Perhaps she was simply too tired to make the return trip and come back later. Perhaps she was too resigned to her circumstances to care whether a stranger witnessed her midday water drawing. Perhaps something deeper was at work, a pull she could not have named, a sense that this encounter, unwelcome as it might seem, was somehow necessary. Jesus watched her approach, and in his watching was contained all the knowledge of who she was and what she had suffered and what she was about to receive. He knew about the 5 husbands. He knew about the man she was currently living with. He knew about the shame that drove her to this well at this hour, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion, about the thirst in her soul that no amount of well water could ever satisfy. He knew her completely, and he had come to meet her anyway, had come specifically to meet her, had arranged his entire journey around this appointment with a woman the world had discarded and forgotten. 2 lives moved toward convergence at the ancient well of Jacob. One was burdened with the accumulated weight of failed relationships and social rejection, approaching her daily task with the mechanical persistence of someone who has stopped hoping for anything better. The other was divine love wrapped in human flesh, weary from the journey but alert with purpose, ready to offer a gift that would transform not only this woman's life, but through her, the lives of an entire village. The moment of their meeting was seconds away, and nothing would ever be the same again. She had almost reached the well when he spoke, and the sound of his voice stopped her as abruptly as if she had walked into an invisible wall. The words themselves were simple enough, a request that travellers made of locals 1,000 times a day across the ancient world. But the fact that he was speaking them to her, that he was speaking to her at all, violated so many boundaries that she could scarcely process what was happening. "Will you give me a drink?" The woman stood frozen, her water jar still balanced on her shoulder, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just heard. A Jewish man, his accent and clothing left no doubt about his origin, had addressed a Samaritan woman directly, without intermediary, without the protective fiction of speaking to a male relative or pretending she was not there. He had asked her for something, had placed himself in a position of need relative to her, had treated her as a person capable of providing what he lacked. In the rigid social calculus of the 1st century Near East, This was not merely unusual, it was scandalous. The barriers he had crossed with those 5 words were multiple and reinforcing. There was the barrier of ethnicity. Jews did not share vessels with Samaritans, did not eat their food or drink from their cups, considered contact with them a source of ritual contamination that required purification before one could participate in proper worship. There was the barrier of gender. Respectable men did not engage in conversation with women who were not their relatives, especially not in public places where such interaction might be observed and misinterpreted. A rabbi speaking privately with a woman was the stuff of scandal, the kind of behaviour that invited gossip and undermined reputations. And there was the barrier of her particular situation. Even if she had been a Jewish woman of spotless character, she was manifestly neither, and any man with a functioning sense of social propriety would have looked away and pretended she did not exist. Jesus looked directly at her and asked for water. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" The question tumbled out of her before she could consider whether it was wise to engage with this stranger. Her voice carried the edge of defensiveness that years of rejection had honed to a fine point, the instinctive parry of someone who expects attack and strikes first to minimize the damage. But beneath the defensiveness was genuine bewilderment. She had lived her entire life within the rigid categories that separated Jew from Samaritan, male from female, respectable from disreputable. She knew how the world worked. She knew where she stood in its hierarchies, and this man was not behaving according to any pattern she recognized. The Gospel of John pauses to explain what she meant, offering a parenthetical note for readers who might not understand the depth of the division. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. The phrase is almost certainly an understatement. The hostility between the two communities was not mere social awkwardness, but active antipathy, rooted in centuries of religious dispute and political conflict. Jews cursed Samaritans in their synagogues, praying that they would have no share in the resurrection of the dead. Samaritans had been known to harass Jewish pilgrims passing through their territory, sometimes violently. The two peoples shared a common ancestry and a common scripture and a common God, and they hated each other with the particular intensity that only family quarrels can generate. Yet here was a Jewish teacher asking a Samaritan woman for water as if none of that history existed, as if the barriers that had been erected over centuries were made of mist rather than stone. Jesus' response to her question did not address the social dynamic she had raised. He did not explain why he was willing to speak to her, did not apologize for the impropriety, did not offer reassurance that he meant no harm. Instead, he shifted the entire conversation onto a different plane, introducing a theme that would carry them from the mundane to the eternal in the space of a few sentences. If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. The words were cryptic, layered with meanings that she could not immediately unpack. The gift of God? Who was this man claiming to be? And what was this living water he spoke of? Was it some spring she did not know about? Some source of fresh water superior to the well where they stood? The phrase living water had a technical meaning in her culture, referring to flowing water from a spring or river, as opposed to the still water collected in cisterns and wells. Such water was preferred for ritual purification, considered more pure and life-giving than water that had been standing. Was this stranger suggesting that he had access to a better water source than Jacob's well? Her response revealed the confusion that his words had created, as well as a spark of something else, curiosity perhaps, or the faint stirring of hope that she had learned to suppress but had never quite managed to extinguish. "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water?" She was being practical, logical, pointing out the obvious difficulties with his claim. He had no bucket. He had no rope. Jacob's well was famously deep, 100 feet or more from surface to water, and drawing from it required equipment that this stranger manifestly did not possess. If he had access to living water, it was not from this well. And if there was another source nearby, she had never heard of it in all her years of living in this region. But even as she raised these practical objections, another question was forming in her mind, a question that went beyond logistics to touch something deeper, something that had to do with identity and authority, and the ancient promises that both Jews and Samaritans were still waiting to see fulfilled. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock? The question was sharper than it might appear to modern readers. Jacob was a figure claimed by both communities, a patriarch whose memory was revered by Samaritans no less than by Jews. This well, which tradition attributed to him, was a tangible link to that ancestral heritage, a physical reminder that the Samaritans were descendants of Israel, whatever the Jews might say about their mixed blood and corrupted worship. For this stranger to claim access to water superior to what Jacob had provided was to claim superiority to Jacob himself, a breathtaking assertion that would require extraordinary evidence to sustain. Jesus did not back away from the implied claim. Instead, he pressed deeper into the mystery he was unveiling, offering words that transformed the conversation from a discussion about water sources into something far more significant. Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life. The statement was impossible to interpret in purely physical terms. No earthly water could satisfy thirst permanently. The body's need for hydration was constant, recurring, part of the cycle of existence that bound all living creatures to their daily search for sustenance. But Jesus was not speaking of physical water, and some part of the woman seemed to recognize this, even as another part of her clung to the literal meaning because the literal meaning was safer, more manageable, less likely to expose the depths of her need. He was speaking of something that could satisfy the deeper thirst, the thirst for meaning, for connection, for the assurance that life was more than an endless succession of empty days. He was speaking of water that would not merely quench, but would become a source, transforming the one who received it from a consumer into a conduit, from a desperate seeker into an overflowing fountain. He was speaking of eternal life, not as a reward postponed until after death, but as a quality of existence available now, springing up from within like an artesian well that never runs dry. The woman could not fully understand what he was offering, not yet, not in this moment when the conversation was still unfolding and the full revelation of his identity was still ahead. But she understood enough to know that she wanted it, whatever it was. The longing that she had buried beneath layers of disappointment and self-protection was rising to the surface, called forth by words that seemed to address her situation with uncanny precision. "Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." The request was still wrapped in practical language. She spoke of not having to make the daily trek to the well, of being freed from the labour that brought her out in the midday heat to avoid the people who despised her. But beneath the practical language was something more vulnerable, more honest, a confession of weariness, an admission that her current existence was barely sustainable, a cry from the depths of a soul that had been thirsting for something it could not name for longer than she could remember. She didn't know that her words had opened a door that Jesus had been waiting to enter. She did not know that her simple request, "Give me this water," was about to lead to a conversation that would expose her deepest wounds and offer her the deepest healing. She knew only that this stranger spoke of things that resonated with an ache she'd carried so long it had become indistinguishable from her own heartbeat. The gift of God was standing before her, offering living water to a woman who had come to draw from a well because the well was all she knew. A simple request for a drink had become the opening of a wounded heart, and the one who had asked was about to reveal that he knew everything about her and wanted to give her everything she needed anyway. The conversation was about to take a turn that would change her life forever. The shift came without warning, a sudden pivot that left her momentarily disoriented. She had asked for living water, had allowed herself, against all her protective instincts, to express a desire for something beyond her daily routine of survival and avoidance, and Jesus had responded not with an explanation or a promise, or even a direct refusal, but with a request that seemed to have nothing to do with water at all. "Go, call your husband, and come here." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Call your husband. It was an ordinary enough instruction, in that culture, Significant conversations with women were properly conducted in the presence of male relatives, and a husband would be the natural person to include in a discussion that had already ventured far beyond casual small talk. But for this particular woman, at this particular moment, the instructions struck at the heart of everything she had spent years trying to hide. She could have lied. The thought must have flickered through her mind in the fraction of a second between his words and her response. She could have invented a husband, claimed he was working in the fields, promised to return with him later. She could have deflected, changed the subject, found some way to steer the conversation back to safer ground. The stranger would never know the difference. He was just a traveller passing through, someone she would never see again after today. What would be the harm in a small deception to preserve her dignity? But something in the way he looked at her made lying impossible. There was a quality to his gaze that she had never encountered before. Not the contempt she was accustomed to receiving from respectable people, not the leering appraisal she had learned to expect from certain kinds of men, but something else entirely. He looked at her as if he already knew everything there was to know about her, and as if that knowledge had not diminished his regard for her in the slightest. He looked at her the way she imagined God might look at a person, if God actually paid attention to people like her. "I have no husband." The admission was barely more than a whisper, forced out through a throat that had suddenly tightened with emotion. 4 words that acknowledged her shame without explaining it, that admitted her situation without defending it, that stripped away the pretense she might have maintained with anyone else. She had no husband. She was alone in a world that defined women by their relationships to men. She was vulnerable, unprotected, living outside the boundaries that gave other women their place in the social order. What came next should have been condemnation. Every experience she had ever had with religious authority suggested that this was the moment when the stranger would draw back, when the warmth in his eyes would turn to ice, when the verdict would be pronounced and she would be dismissed to return to the life she had briefly imagined escaping. She braced herself for it, her shoulders tensing, her eyes dropping to the ground, her heart already beginning to close against the rejection she knew was coming. "You have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." The words should have been an accusation, but somehow they were not. Jesus recited the facts of her life, facts he could not possibly have known through any natural means, with a tenderness that defied explanation. He did not sneer, he did not moralize, he did not lecture her about the error of her ways or demand that she account for herself before receiving whatever blessing he had to offer. He simply acknowledged what was true, spoke aloud the secret she had carried in solitude, and in speaking it aloud somehow transformed it from a source of shame into something that could be faced and dealt with, and perhaps, impossibly, healed. 5 husbands. The number itself was staggering, a catalogue of loss that would have marked any woman as extraordinary in her capacity for suffering. Each marriage would have begun with some hope, however fragile, the hope that this time things would be different, that this man would stay, that the pattern would finally break. And each marriage had ended, whether through death or abandonment or the formal cruelty of a divorce certificate pressed into her hands while neighbours watched and whispered. 5 times she had been someone's wife. 5 times she had been cast back into the uncertain status of a woman without a husband. 5 times the world had told her in its brutal and unambiguous way that she was not enough to keep. The man she now lived with had apparently declined to make her his wife at all. Perhaps he had his reasons. Perhaps he already had a wife elsewhere. Perhaps he was unwilling to take on the stigma of marrying a woman with her history. Perhaps the arrangement suited him precisely because it gave him access to her, without the obligations that marriage would entail. Whatever his reasons, the result was clear. She had exchanged the hope of respectability for the security of a roof over her head and food on her table. It was not much, but it was what she'd been able to negotiate in a world that had stripped away most of her options. And now this stranger, this Jewish teacher who should not have been speaking to her, who had asked her for water and offered her something called living water in return, had laid bare her entire history in a single sentence. He knew everything. There was no hiding from him, no pretense that could survive his penetrating awareness, no mask that would not dissolve under his gaze. The woman's response revealed the seismic shift that had occurred within her. She did not run away. She did not collapse into defensive hostility. She did not deny what he had said or demand to know how he had learned these things. Instead, she made a declaration that acknowledged something profound about who he must be. "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." The statement was more than it appeared. In Samaritan theology, prophecy had ceased after Moses. They did not accept the later prophets that the Jews revered, and they awaited the coming of a single great prophet, the Taheb, who would restore all things. For this woman to identify Jesus as a prophet was to place him in a category that her tradition had reserved for the most extraordinary figures in history. She was not simply making a polite observation about his unusual knowledge. She was beginning to wonder whether she was standing in the presence of someone far greater than an ordinary teacher. But even as this recognition dawned, old habits of self-protection reasserted themselves. The conversation had become too personal, too exposing, too dangerous to the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her wounded heart. She needed distance. She needed to shift the focus away from her own failures and onto something safer, something external, something that would allow her to catch her breath and regain her footing. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. The pivot to theology was almost certainly a defensive maneuver, a retreat from the unbearable intimacy of having her life laid bare. If she could engage this prophet in the ancient debate between Samaritans and Jews, the question of where God was properly worshipped, she could steer the conversation away from her 5 husbands and her current living arrangement and the ache of loneliness that had become the background noise of her existence. Theological controversy was safer than personal exposure. Mountains and temples were easier to discuss than marriages and failures. Yet even in her deflection there was genuine searching. The question of where God could be found was not merely academic for her. It touched on the deepest uncertainties of her spiritual life. Her people worshipped on Mount Gerizim, which rose above them even now, its summit visible from where they stood. The Jews insisted that Jerusalem was the only legitimate place of worship, that the Samaritan temple had been an abomination, that true seekers of God must make pilgrimage to the city of David. Who was right? Where could she actually encounter the divine presence? And if she had been wrong all along about something so fundamental, what hope was there that she could ever find her way to God? Jesus could have dismissed her question as the evasion it partly was. He could have called her back to the personal matters she was trying to escape. He could have refused to engage with a theological debate that seemed designed to derail the more important conversation they had been having. Instead, he met her where she was, recognizing perhaps that her question was not entirely dishonest, that beneath the defensive maneuvering was a genuine hunger for truth that deserved a genuine answer. But the answer he gave would shatter not only the terms of the Samaritan-Jewish debate, but the entire framework within which she had understood worship and access to God. The woman who had come to draw water was about to receive a revelation that would make mountains and temples irrelevant, that would open a way to God that depended not on geography or ancestry or ritual purity, but on something far more fundamental and far more available. She had tried to hide behind theology, but theology itself was about to become the vehicle of her transformation. The prophet she had recognized was about to reveal himself as something far greater than a prophet. And the living water he'd promised was about to become clearer than she had ever imagined possible. Her deepest shame had been spoken aloud, not to condemn her, but to heal her. And now the conversation was ascending toward heights she had never dreamed of reaching. The question she had posed, where should people worship, on this mountain or in Jerusalem, was the oldest and most bitter controversy between her people and the Jews. It was the theological equivalent of a fortified wall, a position from which generations of Samaritans had defended their legitimacy against Jewish claims of exclusive access to God. She had retreated behind, this wall instinctively seeking shelter from the exposure of having her life laid bare. But the prophet standing before her was not interested in defending walls or winning arguments. He was about to tear down the entire structure and replace it with something that neither Samaritans nor Jews had ever imagined. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. The words must have struck her like a physical blow. Neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, the entire dispute that had defined her people's identity for centuries, the question of which sacred site was legitimate, which priesthood was valid, which tradition preserved the true worship of the God of Abraham, was being rendered irrelevant in a single sentence. Jesus was not siding with the Jews against the Samaritans, nor was he validating the Samaritan position against Jerusalem. He was announcing the end of a religious paradigm that both communities had assumed would last until the Messiah came to settle the matter once and for all. But he was not finished. Having undermined the terms of the debate, he went on to acknowledge that the debate had not been entirely without meaning. You worship what you do not know, we worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. The statement was honest, even blunt. The Samaritans, in limiting their scripture to the 5 books of Moses, had cut themselves off from the fuller revelation that the prophets had provided. They worshipped sincerely, but their worship was incomplete, shaped by a truncated understanding of God's character and purposes. The Jews, for all their faults and failures, had preserved the writings that pointed toward the coming salvation. The Messiah would emerge from Jewish soil, would fulfill Jewish prophecy, would bring to completion what God had begun with Abraham and Moses and David. Salvation was of the Jews, not because the Jews were morally superior or more deserving, but because God had chosen to work through their history to accomplish his redemptive purposes. Yet even this acknowledgement of Jewish priority was subordinate to the larger point Jesus was making. The hour was coming. Indeed, it had already arrived, when the old categories would be transcended entirely. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The revelation unfolded like a flower opening to the sun, each phrase adding depth and dimension to what had come before. True worshippers, the Father seeking, spirit and truth. These were not merely theological concepts to be debated and analysed. They were an invitation into a new way of relating to God that depended on nothing external. Not mountains, not temples, not rituals, not ancestry, not even moral perfection. The woman standing at the well with her 5 failed marriages and her current irregular arrangement was being told that access to God was available to her, right now, exactly as she was. The implications were staggering. If worship was a matter of spirit and truth, rather than sacred geography, then the entire system of religious exclusion that had marginalised people like her was being overturned. The priest in Jerusalem who would have refused her entry to the inner courts because of her gender and her history, they did not hold the keys to God's presence after all. The Samaritan authorities who might have judged her unworthy to participate in the festivals on Mount Gerizim, they could not prevent her from encountering the Father if the Father himself was seeking her. The barriers that had kept her isolated, the shame that had driven her to draw water in the heat of the day, the accumulated weight of religious and social rejection, none of it could separate her from a God who was spirit, who could be worshipped anywhere, who cared about the posture of the heart rather than the location of the body. God is spirit. The statement was both revelation and revolution. The pagans imagined their gods as localized beings, attached to particular shrines and temples, accessible only through specific rituals performed in designated places. Even the Jews, with their sophisticated theology of divine omnipresence, had developed a practical religion centered on the temple in Jerusalem, the one place where sacrifices could be offered, where the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, where the presence of God was understood to dwell in a unique and concentrated way. But Jesus was announcing that the God who had chosen to make his presence known in the temple was not limited to the temple, that his essential nature as spirit meant he could be encountered wherever hearts turned toward him in genuine seeking, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The must was not a command so much as a description of reality. Given who God is, given his nature as spirit, worship that reaches him must correspond to that nature. External observances, however meticulously performed, cannot substitute for the interior disposition of the heart. Pilgrimages to sacred sites, however sincere the intention, cannot replace the truth that must characterize genuine encounter with the God who is himself truth. The woman who had spent her life navigating external systems of religious and social expectation was being told that what mattered most happened on the inside, in the spirit that reached toward God, in the truth that acknowledged both his nature and her own. for the Father is seeking such to worship him." This phrase, easily overlooked, contains perhaps the most radical element of Jesus' teaching. God is not passive, waiting for worshippers to find their way to him through the maze of religious requirements. God is active, seeking, pursuing those who will worship him in the way he desires. The woman at the well had thought she was coming to draw water. In reality, the Father had sent his Son to this specific location at this specific hour to seek her out. She was not finding God, God was finding her. The initiative was entirely his, the grace entirely unearned, the invitation extended not because she deserved it, but because the Father desired her worship. The woman listened to these words, and something stirred within her that had been dormant for longer than she could remember. It was not yet full understanding. The implications of what Jesus was saying would take time to unfold, would require the events of the coming years to make fully clear. But it was recognition, the sense that she was hearing something true, something that addressed the deepest questions she had carried without even knowing she was carrying them. All her life, she had been on the outside respectable society, outside the religious systems that claimed to mediate access to God, outside the community of the blessed and the chosen. And now she was being told that the outside and the inside were not what she had thought, that the God she had sought from a distance was actually seeking her, that the worship she had assumed was beyond her reach was available right here, right now, in the truth of her own broken heart. Her response revealed both the hope that was kindling within her and the caution that years of disappointment had instilled. "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." It was a statement of faith, however tentative, an acknowledgement that she believed in the coming one, the Dahib of Samaritan expectation, the Christ of Jewish prophecy. When he comes, he will explain everything. The mysteries that had confused her, the questions that had troubled her, the disputes that had divided her people from the Jews, all of it would be resolved when the Messiah finally appeared. She was placing her hope in a future figure, looking ahead to a coming revelation, waiting for someone who would make sense of the chaos and point the way to God. She did not realize that she was talking to him. Jesus' response was the climax of the entire conversation, the moment toward which everything had been building since he first asked her for a drink. The words he spoke were simple, direct, and utterly transformative. "I who speak to you am he." In Greek, the phrase carries resonances that English cannot fully capture. Ego eimi, I am, was the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush, the self-identification of the God who needed no other name because he simply was. Jesus was not merely claiming to be the Messiah. He was claiming an identity that reached back to the foundations of reality itself, an identity that the woman's own Samaritan scriptures, the 5 books of Moses that her people revered, had associated with the very being of God. The Messiah was not coming. The Messiah was here. The one who would tell them all things was standing before her, had asked her for water, had offered her living water in return, had exposed her wounds with compassion rather than condemnation, had revealed a new way of worship that transcended mountains and temples and all the barriers that had kept her far from God. The future she'd been waiting for had arrived in the present. The hope she had deferred was standing at the well, looking into her eyes, speaking words that would echo through eternity. A weary woman who had come to draw water in the heat of the day had become the first recorded Samaritan to hear Jesus declare his identity. The outcast had received the revelation that prophets and kings had longed to see, and the living water that had been promised was beginning to spring up within her, a fountain that would never run dry. The moment of revelation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple pairs of sandals crunching on the dry path that led from the village. The disciples were returning from their errand, carrying the food they had purchased from Samaritan merchants, their faces still bearing traces of the discomfort they had felt transacting business with people they had been taught to despise. They came around the bend in the path and stopped short, confronted by a scene that violated every expectation they had carried with them from Galilee. Their rabbi was talking to a woman, not just any woman, but a Samaritan woman, alone, at a well, in the middle of the day. The impropriety of the situation would have been obvious to anyone raised in the religious culture of first-century Judaism. Men did not engage in extended conversation with women who were not their relatives. Teachers did not discuss matters of substance with females, whose capacity for spiritual understanding was widely questioned. And Jews certainly did not have intimate theological discussions with Samaritans, whose very existence was a reminder of ancient apostasy and ongoing contamination. The Gospel of John records their reaction with characteristic understatement. They marvelled that he talked with a woman. The word translated marvelled carries connotations of astonishment bordering on shock. They were stunned, bewildered, uncertain how to process what they were witnessing. Yet the text also notes something equally significant. No one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" They had been with Jesus long enough to know that questioning his actions rarely led anywhere productive. He operated by a logic they did not fully understand, moved by imperatives they could not always see, and the wisest course was usually to watch and wait and trust that the meaning would become clear in time. But the woman was not watching and waiting. The woman was moving. She left her water jar. The detail seems almost incidental, a minor narrative note that might easily be overlooked in the drama of what was unfolding. But the Gospel writer includes it deliberately, and those who have followed the story understand why. She had come to this well for one purpose: to draw water, to fill her jar, to carry it back to the village and meet the daily needs that bound her to her routine of survival. The jar was her reason for being here. The jar was her daily burden, the vessel she carried on her shoulder through the heat of the midday sun because the morning and evening hours were denied to her by the social dynamics of her shame. The jar was, in some sense, a symbol of everything her life had become. The weight she bore, the task that defined her days, the container that could never hold enough to satisfy her deeper thirst. And she left it behind. She did not pause to fill it. She did not carefully set it aside with plans to return for it later. She simply abandoned it there at the wellhead. Irrelevant now, unnecessary, a relic of the life she had been living before a stranger asked her for a drink and ended up offering her something infinitely more valuable than anything that jar could ever hold. The woman who had come to draw water was leaving without water, and she did not care because she had found something better. The symbolism extends beyond the physical vessel. In leaving her water jar, she was leaving behind more than ceramic and convenience. She was leaving behind the shame that had driven her to this well at this hour. She was leaving behind the isolation that had become her constant companion. She was leaving behind the identity of the outcast, the failure, the woman with too many husbands and not enough respectability. She was leaving behind the old life entirely, and she was running, actually running, toward the village she had spent years avoiding. The transformation was immediate and total. The woman who had structured her entire existence around avoiding other people was now seeking them out. The woman who had learned to keep her head down and her eyes averted was about to look her neighbours in the face and speak to them boldly. The woman who had assumed she had nothing to offer anyone was about to offer them the most important information any of them would ever receive. She burst into the village like a messenger bearing urgent news, which is precisely what she was. The people of Sychar would have recognised her, would have known her reputation, her history, her place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They would have been accustomed to looking through her as if she did not exist, to the whispered comments and sidelong glances that followed her whenever she appeared in public. But something was different now. Something in her face, her voice, her bearing communicated that the woman they thought they knew had become someone else entirely. "Come, see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" The invitation was audacious. She was asking respectable citizens of Sychar to follow her, to trust her judgment to investigate a claim that would have sounded insane coming from anyone, let alone coming from her. But she did not apologize for her boldness. She did not qualify her words with reminders of her own unworthiness. She simply told them what had happened. A man had told her everything about her life, had seen into the depths of her soul, had known things he could not possibly have known through any ordinary means, and she invited them to come and see for themselves. The phrasing of her question deserves attention. Could this be the Christ? In the Greek, the construction suggests that she expected a negative answer. Literally, this isn't the Christ, is it? Some scholars see this as lingering doubt, an uncertainty about the conclusion she had drawn from her encounter at the well. But another reading is possible. Perhaps she framed her invitation this way deliberately, understanding that the people of Sychar would be more likely to investigate a question than to accept a proclamation. If she had declared flatly, "I have found the Messiah," they might have dismissed her as delusional, another embarrassment from a woman who had already provided so many. But by framing it as a question, by inviting them to come and see and draw their own conclusions, she created space for their curiosity without demanding their immediate belief. Whatever her rhetorical strategy, the results were remarkable. The text says simply that they went out of the city and came to him. They left their work, their meals, their afternoon routines. They walked the path to Jacob's well, following a woman they had spent years ignoring, drawn by the possibility that she might have stumbled onto something extraordinary. The rejected one had become a messenger. The outcast had become a catalyst. The woman who had hidden from her community in shame was now leading that community toward the greatest encounter of their lives. Back at the well, Jesus was having a different conversation with his disciples. They had urged him to eat. The food they had carried from the village was ready, and he had been sitting in the sun for hours without sustenance. But Jesus seemed distracted, focused on something they could not see, nourished by something they did not understand. "I have food to eat of which you do not know." The disciples were confused, as they so often were when Jesus spoke in metaphors that transcended their literal-minded expectations. Had someone brought him food while they were away? Had the woman given him something to eat? They murmured among themselves, trying to make sense of his words, while Jesus smiled at their confusion and offered an explanation that would resonate through centuries of Christian mission. "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." The encounter at the well had not been a distraction from his mission. It had been the very heart of his mission. The Father had sent him to seek and save the lost, and he had just found one, a lost woman, hiding at a well in the middle of the day, carrying wounds that no human remedy could heal. In offering her living water, in revealing her past with compassion rather than condemnation, in declaring his identity to one whom the religious establishment would have dismissed as unworthy of such revelation, Jesus had been doing exactly what he had been sent to do, and the doing of it had nourished him more deeply than any bread or fish ever could. The disciples did not yet understand what was coming. They did not know that the woman was at that very moment stirring up the village, that a crowd was beginning to form, that the people of Sychar were about to stream out toward the well where their rabbi sat teaching them about spiritual food and divine mission. But Jesus knew. He could see it unfolding, could trace the ripples spreading outward from a single conversation, could watch the harvest beginning to come in. Do you not say, "There are still 4 months and then comes the harvest"? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. The disciples looked up, and they saw them coming, a procession of Samaritans, men and women, and perhaps children too, walking toward the well where a Jewish teacher sat surrounded by his Jewish followers. They were the harvest. They were the fields white and ready for reaping. And the one who had planted the seed, the one who had gone before to prepare the way, was a woman whose name would never be recorded, but whose testimony would echo through eternity. A rejected woman had become the first missionary to her people, and the water jar she had left behind would never be needed again. They came in a stream at first, then a river, the people of Sychar pouring out of their village and making their way along the dusty path toward Jacob's well. Merchants left their stalls unattended, women abandoned their cooking fires, elders rose from the shade where they had been passing the afternoon hours in conversation. Something had happened, something extraordinary, and the entire community was in motion to discover what it was. At the head of this unlikely procession walked the woman who had set it all in motion. She was not hiding now, not averting her eyes, not shrinking to the edges of the crowd as she had done for so many years. She walked with her head lifted, her pace quick with purpose, leading her neighbours toward an encounter that would reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about God and salvation, and the boundaries between peoples. The transformation in her was visible to everyone who looked. Something had changed, something fundamental, and whatever had caused that change was worth investigating. The disciples watched them approach with a mixture of wonder and unease. These were Samaritans, after all, the people their culture had taught them to despise, the inhabitants of the land they had hoped to pass through quickly and forget. And yet here they came, drawn by the testimony of a woman their rabbi had spent the better part of an hour talking with, seeking the same Jesus who had just told his followers that the fields were white for harvest. The theology of the moment was working itself out in real time before their eyes, in ways that challenged everything they had assumed about who was included in God's purposes and who was not. Jesus rose to meet them. The weariness that had marked him when he first sat down at the well seemed to have lifted, replaced by an energy that flowed from something deeper than physical rest. He had spoken of food the disciples did not know about, of doing the will of the one who sent him, and now that mysterious nourishment was visible in his bearing. The man who had been too tired to accompany his followers to the village was now fully present, fully engaged, ready to welcome a crowd of Samaritans who had come because a broken woman had told them she had found something worth seeing. The conversation that followed is not recorded in detail. The Gospel of John moves quickly from the woman's testimony to its results, summarizing rather than narrating the interactions between Jesus and the people of Sychar. But we know what happened. We know that many of them believed in him because of the woman's word, her simple declaration that he had told her everything she ever did. They had known her history, had watched her marriages fail one after another, had observed her current living arrangement with the disapproval that small communities specialize in. And now this woman of all people, was telling them that a stranger at the well had seen through her entirely, had known things about her that she had never told anyone, had spoken to her with an authority that could only come from God. Her testimony was not polished. It was not theological. It did not cite scripture or construct elaborate arguments for messianic identity. It was simply this: he told me everything I ever did. The words carried weight precisely because of who was speaking them. If this had been a respectable woman, a pillar of the community, someone whose judgment was trusted, and whose word carried automatic authority, the response might have been different. But this was the woman they had whispered about, the one whose presence at the well they had learned to avoid, the one whose failures they had catalogued with the meticulous attention that the righteous devote to the sins of others. And she was transformed. Whatever had happened at that well had changed her, and they wanted to know what it was. The Samaritans asked Jesus to stay with them. The invitation was remarkable on multiple levels. Jews and Samaritans did not share hospitality any more than they shared drinking vessels, and for an entire village to invite a Jewish teacher to remain among them was virtually unprecedented. But they extended the invitation, and Jesus accepted it. He stayed 2 days, teaching and talking, answering questions and addressing doubts, making himself available to people whom his own culture would have dismissed as unworthy of his attention. And in those 2 days, something extraordinary happened. The Gospel records it with a phrase that captures both the expansion and the deepening of faith among the Samaritans. Many more believed because of his own word. The woman's testimony had brought them to Jesus. Jesus' own teaching had brought them to conviction. They had come curious, perhaps skeptical, certainly uncertain about what to make of the strange story the woman had told them. They left believing, not just accepting her account of what had happened, but encountering Jesus for themselves and reaching their own conclusions about who he was. The declaration they made to the woman at the end of those 2 days reveals the maturity of their new faith. Now we believe, not because of what you said, for we ourselves have heard him, and we know that this is indeed the Christ, the Saviour of the world. The words might seem almost dismissive of her contribution, not because of what you said, but they are actually the highest compliment her testimony could receive. She had not asked them to believe her. She had asked them to come and see for themselves. She had not demanded that they accept her conclusions. She had invited them to investigate and reach their own, and they had done exactly that. They had come, they had seen, they had heard, and they had believed, not with a borrowed faith that depended on her credibility, but with a first-hand conviction rooted in their own encounter with Jesus. Her testimony had served its purpose perfectly. It had brought them to the one who could give them something she could not give, a direct relationship with the Messiah himself, the Saviour of the world. The phrase is striking, appearing here for the first time in John's Gospel, and carrying implications that would take years to fully unfold. These Samaritans, despised by the Jews, considered half-breeds and heretics, and worse, were the first to recognize that Jesus' significance extended beyond the boundaries of any single nation or people. He was not merely the Jewish Messiah, come to restore the fortunes of Israel and establish a kingdom centered on Jerusalem. He was the Savior of the world, a title that embraced Samaritans and Jews alike, that reached beyond the ancient rivalries to encompass all of humanity, that proclaimed a salvation available to everyone who would receive it regardless of ancestry or geography or religious pedigree. The woman who had drawn this revelation forth would return to her daily life in Sychar after Jesus departed. The Gospel does not follow her further, does not record what became of her in the years that followed, does not tell us whether she ever saw Jesus again, or what she made of the reports that would eventually reach Samaria about his death and resurrection. Her story simply ends, or rather it merges into the larger story of the Samaritan believers who had become part of the early church, who had received the gospel when Philip came to preach in their region, who would welcome Peter and John when the apostles came to confirm what God was doing among them. But her legacy endures in ways that transcend the boundaries of her own narrative. She was the first evangelist to the Samaritans, the first to carry the news of Jesus beyond the Jewish community that had given him birth. She was living proof that the living water Jesus offered could transform anyone, regardless of their past, regardless of their failures, regardless of the shame they carried, or the labels the world had assigned them. She was the answer to anyone who wondered whether God could use broken vessels, whether grace could reach the margins, whether the outcast could become an instrument of salvation for others. The woman with 5 husbands and an irregular arrangement became the vessel through which an entire village encountered the Messiah. Her complicated past did not disqualify her. It became part of her testimony, evidence of the searching gaze of Jesus that could see everything and still offer love. Her social isolation did not prevent her from serving God. It positioned her for an encounter that would have been impossible in a crowd, a private conversation that could address her specific wounds and offer her specific healing. Her shame did not limit what God could do through her. It became the very credential that made her testimony compelling, because if Jesus could transform someone like her, he could transform anyone. The well where they met still exists, or at least a site that tradition identifies as Jacob's well, located in the Palestinian territories near the city of Nablus, the modern descendant of ancient Shechem. Pilgrims have visited it for centuries, drawing water from its depths and remembering the conversation that took place there 2,000 years ago. The Orthodox Church that now encloses the site is built around the wellhead, incorporating it into a sacred space where believers from around the world come to contemplate what happened when a weary Messiah asked a weary woman for a drink of water. But the real legacy of that conversation is not found in any physical location. It is found wherever people discover that the barriers they thought separated them from God are not as solid as they appeared. It is found wherever the shamed and the marginalized learn that the Father is seeking worshippers who will worship him in spirit and truth, regardless of what mountains they have climbed or failed to climb. It is found wherever someone with a complicated past and an uncertain present hears the voice of Jesus offering living water that will never run dry. Everyone has a well they return to out of habit or shame, some daily task they perform at times, and in ways designed to minimize contact with a world that has hurt them. Everyone has a water jar they carry, a burden that has become so familiar it feels like part of who they are. Everyone has a past that they would prefer to keep hidden, failures they have stopped hoping anyone could forgive, wounds they have concluded will never heal. And Jesus still waits at the well, offering living water to anyone who will receive it. He's not deterred by the barriers that human cultures erect between peoples. He's not limited by the categories that religions use to sort the worthy from the unworthy. He's not repulsed by the failures that accumulate over a lifetime of trying and falling short. He sees everything, every marriage, every compromise, every moment of shame, and he offers grace anyway. He speaks the truth about who we are, not to condemn us, but to free us from the exhausting pretense that we're anything other than what we are. He invites us to leave our water jars behind and run toward a new life, carrying news that others need to hear. The woman at the well has no name in Scripture, but she has a face, the face of everyone who has ever felt unworthy of God's attention and discovered that God was seeking them all along. Her story is an invitation, extended across the centuries to come and see a man who knows everything about us and loves us still. The fields are white for harvest, the living water is still flowing, and the one who spoke to a Samaritan woman in the heat of the day is still speaking, still offering, still transforming everyone who comes to him and drinks. Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that he gives will never thirst, for it will become a fountain, springing up into everlasting life.